Moving on to your later career, which you seem to move from post to post and rank to rank in what I would consider supersonic speed.
That's an exaggeration.
But brilliant. You did some fascinating jobs, and I think it's very easy for those outside the service to understand what kind of responsibilities you took. And what was your favourite job, and what aspect do you think you did best at?
Oh, crikey. I suppose the job which gave me, well, it's very difficult to answer the question in the sense that, if you divide your life in the service into three segments, being squadron pilot, up to possibly being a squadron commander. I mean, that life was different from being a force commander and station commander at Goodisloe up until, certainly about two-star rank. And then two-star rank and above, your life is different again. And you're not quite comparing apples and oranges. But I suppose if I look back on the totality of my career, the job which I got most satisfaction from, and dare I say, mostly pleasure from, was being Harrier Force Commander and Station Commander at Goodisloe. Again, I was extended there again. I did nearly 3 years, and this is because of an exercise called Lionheart, which was the biggest reinforcement of British forces in Germany that had been done since the war. And I was told, right, you're not going when you should go. You've got to stay on another 4 or 5 months or whatever to see this exercise through. I'm glad I did. It was a hugely, it was just the challenge of the job. One of those jobs where you get up in the morning and you can't wait to get into work. Do you know what I mean? It's, and I was flying 3 different types of airplane. I was flying, obviously, the Harrier still. And then I converted onto the Puma before I went there. And I converted on the Chinook when I was there. I mean, it really was great fun and hugely enjoyable.
I think
apart from commanding the whole thing and seeing the whole shooting match, Air Force and all our soldiers, because you see both forces were off-base deployed forces. And so we had large contingents of sappers, Royal Engineers and Royal Signals who worked with us. When you saw that lot on song, when it really was going for it, I would say I was power crazy, but it really gave you a huge feeling of professional satisfaction, and to see the guys doing it and enjoying doing it as well was just hugely rewarding.
Yes, I can't imagine. It sounds fantastic.
It was fun.
Moving on to the later part of your career, you mentioned that, and you do in your book dwell for a while on the infighting that you sometimes observe between politicians and even heads of service, and how it, particularly in the services, more interaction, more cooperation was required. That was seen to be in direct contrast with your experiences in the lower ranks, when you often at joint headquarters and operational commands, you got on very well with the other services and were able to cooperate and get things done. Why was it a little bit different when you were at the higher ranks?
I don't think so much, dare I say, in the higher ranks. I mean, the time that it really came home to me was when I was Director of Air Staff Briefing, and this was in the time of the Not Defence Review in 1980, 81, yes, around about then. It was before the Falklands War. And as ever, we had a new administration. It was Prime Minister Thatcher's administration. As ever, there was financial problems and so on, and the spotlight, as ever, was on the Ministry of Defence to cut back spending. Mark you, we were spending at the time 5-6% of GDP on defence. And when the review started, the atmosphere amongst the uniformed staff, certainly within the Ministry of Defence, was pretty poisonous. Basically what happened, well, my perception was at the time, as CAS's briefing officer, was that the army sat on the fence. They weren't too worried because they had their 65 kilometres of front in the central region to defend. They had the forces to defend it, all of which had been declared to NATO. And then, of course, most importantly, well, of similar, if not greater importance, was Northern Ireland, with the battalions all rotating through there from Germany and so on and so forth. So I think they felt that nothing of this is going to hurt us. So it boiled down, as ever, at that time, to a dogfight between the Army, the Navy and the Air Force. And the relationships between the two services in the Ministry of Defence were awful. And I can, I used to have this sort of tour of the corridors. I think I've said in there, I mean, there were some naval officers, staff officers, who wouldn't speak to me. It was because they knew I was CAS's briefing officer, etc. And I can remember going to various meetings when we were trying to hammer out papers that were going to be presented to the chiefs of staff for discussion, some really bitter arguments going on there. And so it was bad. It really was bad. Later on, during the post-Cold War period, the RAF really did come under the hammer in a big way. I think that the first exercise to find this so-called peace dividend, which I thought was a nonsense anyway, we'd already enjoyed the peace dividend of 4 decades plus of peace in Europe. But the point, no, it's got to be a peace dividend. The Cold War's over, broad sunlit uplands and so on and so forth. More money, money out of defence. And they started options for change. That was the first one. Well, it doesn't exactly give you any options for change. It doesn't actually reek to me of a sort of government strategy at all. What are they looking at? And then we had Gulf War I, just after the decisions were made to impose very radical cutbacks in terms of loss of squadrons and so on, people in the Air Force. We had Gulf War I, and the moment that was finished, down came the axe. Squadrons going left, right and centre, which had fought during the Gulf War. Manpower suddenly sort of coming down from 93,000, I forget initially, to, 60, 70, a substantial cut anyway. And it was as though the Gulf War had never happened. And that's what really got me at the time. And then no sooner had you got through that wave than they went on to another one that was called Frontline First, or Defence Cost Studies, which was supposed to look at all the support functions and the rest of it, the usual MOD, civil service, treasury music of, we'll take money out of there to improve the strength of the front line and so on. And it really was a miserable period for the Royal Air Force. People thought in the MOD, and I think the other two services thought that the Air Force got it pretty lightly after defence costs, the first one, options for change. And if you like, within the Ministry of Defence, there was a feeling in some quarters that, well, we'll sort the Air Force out now with the defence cost studies. And for all sorts of reasons, which I don't want to go into in here, but I've written about in the book. It was a bad time for the Air Force. So what happens then is, come 97, you have an election. I mean, anyone with an ounce of nous would have known that the New Labour were going to get in, and that inevitably meant there was going to be a defence review, because they said they were going to do a defence review. It's part of, I remember, their election manifesto. Whereas the money that the Conservatives were taking up, bang, 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 at that time, in my view, of course, that was all being sort of chucked into vote-winning bits of defence, of government expenditure. When, as I say, anyone with an ounce of common sense knew they were going to lose the election anyway. That's precisely what happened. We then had the Strategic Defence Review of 97-98. I met up very early on with the first Sea Lord, who was Admiral Jock Slater, who remains a friend to this day. And we both agreed that everyone would expect the Navy and the Air Force to be at each other's throats. We both remembered the bad times of the early 80s, and we both agreed it would be a good thing if we stopped this happening. And we only went up the ladder, as it were, to get political direction, or indeed to explain our difficulties to CDS, if we couldn't actually hammer out agreement between the two of us. And that's precisely what we managed to do. So I think that in the SDR of 97-98, the animosities that had been so febrile before had quietened down, and people took, I think, a much more balanced and sensible view to what was required for the defence of the country. And I think the Strategic Defence Review, as it was run by George Robertson and John Reed specifically, was a good exercise in the circumstances of the time, until, of course, it came to paying the bill, which right at the end, which the good Chancellor at the time, Gordon Brown, didn't cough up for. Well, he didn't cough up the whole lot that was required.
Of course, it's been a very difficult few decades for the armed services, and particularly the Royal Air Force, with diminishing funds, shrinking in size, but yet with still enormous and often very dangerous conflicts for us to fight in. We've hardly had a period of what we would term peace for a considerable length of time. How do those two measure up?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you straight out. I mean, since the end of the Cold War, not one day has gone by when the Royal Air Force has not been committed to operations somewhere in the world that range from high-intensity conflict at one end of the scale and to humanitarian relief at the other.
I don't think the general public realise this.
No, they don't. Funny enough, I was up at Newcastle University a week or so ago, giving a sort of centennial appraisal, the Royal Air Force, to their defence faculty. And I made that point very strongly, that if you go back to the mid-90s, when the Air Force was reducing from a service of about 93,000 under government edict down to a service at that stage of 55,000, with redundancies, contractualization, civilianization and so on, at one and the same time, the operational demands on the service was steadily increasing. And I mean, figures I can roll off the top of my head. If you look, for example, at the Balkans, who today remembers that between 1994 and 1996, 1992 and 1996, a 4-year period, the Royal Air Force Hercules were delivering 20 tons of supplies a week into Sarajevo. More than 20% of the total UN airlift into the besieged city of Sarajevo was transported by the Royal Air Force. No one knows about that today. No one knows, again, in the very same year, that we spent 6,000 hours flying our combat aircraft, Harriers, Jaguars, Tornadoes, over North and South Iraq, imposing the no-fly zones as mandated by the United Nations. No one knows that we were doing 10,000 hours of flying over the Balkans, imposing the no-fly zone as mandated by the United Nations. And that's just our combat aircraft. That's no mention at all of our combat support aeroplanes like tankers, air transport, AWACS and so on. And so we were doing this vast amount of effort, but one at the same time, the fighting strength of the Air Force and the manning of the Air Force and the demands on our engineers were huge. And then people will say, well, you've got a retention problem. Why have you got a retention problem? Well, I can tell you why you've got a retention problem.
You moved on to a NATO job, which I understand was one of the joys of your career, a fascinating job. Perhaps you can explain a little more about that.
Well, at the end of the Cold War, we weren't the only people searching for a peace dividend, and this was obviously very, the NATO, European NATO members were all doing precisely the same thing, trying to cut down defence expenditure. And one of the things they looked at was a reorganisation of the structure of Allied Command Europe. And it was decided that the then Allied forces, Northern Europe, would become a slightly larger command in terms of geographical area, Northwest Europe, and that the headquarters would be taken out of Norway and would be brought back to the United Kingdom. And this was to be a new joint command. It was going to be the new face of NATO in the sense it was going to be an electronic command headquarters using widespread IT for the very first time in NATO and so on and so forth. And what basically happened was we stood the headquarters up in, I forget, about July 94. John Thompson, who was expected to take over as CS in a couple of years' time, moved from being CNC Strike to be the first Commander-in-Chief Allied Forces Northwest Europe. I took over as CNC Strike Commander. I've been the DCNC, so there wasn't exactly a change of circumstances all that much. And very sadly, John went there and he suffered a couple of strokes, and not to cut a short story, so an absolute tragedy, he died. All within a matter of a week.
Oh, wow.
Just after he'd taken command of Af Northwest. And a week later, I was told I was going now from Strike Command to take over that job, basically to set up the new brand new NATO headquarters. And so I only did 6 weeks as 6th CNC Strike Command before I went across to Af Northwest.
Another bolt from the blue.
You're dead right. That was a bolt from the blue. And so you go across there, and the site of the headquarters were co-located at High Wycombe, being completely built on a NATO budget, and so that was all very well and good, and it had lots and lots of IT and about 9 nations represented there. And so I went across there, and my job basically was to get this up to a full operating capability. The experience that I had had during Gulf War One was huge, and dare I say with the Army when I was Commander Air First British Corps, was hugely advantageous in this, because I didn't know much about maritime operations, but I set about learning something about them. And so setting the headquarters up, exercises down in the bunker, getting people used to using, I mean, a lot of the staff officers came in who had never seen a computer before. And we arranged a course with some establishment in Oxford, so that when they arrived, the first thing they did was to go and do a computer course, how to operate a PC. And then they came back in and they could start tapping away. And in fact, we had an absolutely brilliant CIS man who was a Dane, Benston, he was a naval commodore called Benston, Ivan Benston. He was absolutely brilliant. And so getting the whole thing up and running was a challenge, but it was an enjoyable challenge when you see 9 nations actually, and a majority of them, dare I say, being sailors. The maritime bit was the heaviest in the headquarters, coming together to make this whole thing work. And then, of course, the travelling, getting to know Norway. I had a flat which was given to me by NATO in Oslo, so I could go across there regularly to make sure the Norwegians weren't feeling left out of it. The Norwegians actually gave me an office in Akershus Fortress, which was very a nice quiet place. You had to write speeches and do things like that. Good place to go. And then travelling the length and breadth of Norway and finding out about the country and so on and so forth was brilliant. Sailing with navies, great fun. I spent an awful lot of time there flogging around on the Og, learning about naval and maritime operations, both with the German Navy and the US Navy and the Royal Navy in particular. And then Partnership for Peace, big NATO initiative with former Warsaw Pact countries and non-aligned countries like Finland and Sweden. I got to know the Poles very well and the Czechs as well. And we started fixing up exercises with them, which was, again, it was a path on the right way. And the Baltic republics, of course, were all gagging to get into NATO. And going out and visiting them and seeing how the Soviet Union had left their stamp very firmly on them, particularly on their military, again, was absolutely fascinating. And I was trying to explain to them that it was all very well joining NATO, but there were certain responsibilities that came with it and so on. And of course, the reason they wanted to do this, they were terrified of the Russian Federation sort of kind of pouring back in again and so on. They wanted the Article 5 protection. My own view, for what it's worth, is that NATO swallowed this pill far, far too quickly. And it was inevitably going to upset the Russians, and that we could have handled the whole thing far more. Calmly is the wrong word, but we not exactly kicking it into the long grass, but we could have done it in a far more measured pace and kept possibly the Russians on board while we were doing it, as opposed to antagonizing them perhaps by the very speed that we brought, particularly the Baltic republics, into the NATO fold. But that was the wish of the NAC, the North Atlantic Council.
And there is a different type of Russian leader now.
Yes,
Back
that's true.
in the time of Gorbachev,
Yes.
there are a lot more friendly relations, I expect.
Well, I mean, the Russians that I met, I didn't go, one place I didn't go to was Russia, and there were 2 reasons for this. I was invited to go there to go and meet the Russian, or the general staff in Moscow. I'd accepted the invitation, and that's just when they went in and bombed the living hell. And it was absolutely disgraceful what they did. It was one of the smaller southeastern countries. I'm sorry, the name has completely just missed me at the moment. It'll come back to me in a minute. But I was just when they started doing that, and Sakyur, who was was an American Army general, George Jalwin, phoned me up, and he said, Dick, he said, I don't think it's politic to go. And I said, I absolutely agree. And I was going to come to you. And so I cancelled the invitation. I said, because of the present circumstances and so on, I don't think it's advisable for me to come and have talks with you. Well, next year, the invitation was reissued, and by now they've got control of this state. And this time they withdrew the invitation because I was accused of proselytizing for NATO in the Baltic republics. So I never got to Russia.